Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through the grand and often perplexing story of the Roman Empire. Tonight, we shall embark upon its slow and deliberate twilight, a period of immense change, sometimes tumultuous, sometimes subtle, eventually leading to what many call its fall. For centuries, the name Rome echoed across continents, signifying power, order, and an almost unimaginable reach. Imagine, if you will, an empire that spanned vast swathes of Europe, embraced the fertile lands of Egypt, and touched the sun-baked shores of North Africa. It truly was a monumental achievement in human civilization. But even the mightiest structures, etched in stone and ambition, are subject to the relentless currents of time. Now, when we speak of Rome's decline, it's easy to picture a sudden, dramatic collapse, perhaps a single, decisive battle or a dramatic overthrow. Indeed, Hollywood often paints such vivid, if somewhat misleading, pictures. Yet the reality, as is often the case with history, is far more nuanced, more intricate. It was not a thunderclap, you see, but rather a long, slow erosion, a shifting of sands that gradually undermined its foundations. It was a process, not a singular event. Historians have pondered this colossal question for centuries. What brought down an empire that seemed invincible? Was it the incessant gaze of external threats, the so-called barbarian tribes at its borders? Or perhaps the seeds of ruin lay within, nurtured by internal strife, economic woes, or even profound shifts in its very social fabric? Tonight, we begin by setting the stage, by understanding the sheer scale of this empire and the fundamental concepts that guided it. And then, slowly, we shall peel back the layers of time to reveal the murmurs of change that began to whisper through its provinces. We will consider the many facets of this story, not just the clamor of battle, but the quiet hum of commerce, the weight of political decisions, and the subtle shifts in belief that shaped an entire civilization's destiny. So let us begin our quiet contemplation of the factors, both seen and unseen, that contributed to the transformation of the Roman world. A gradual unfolding that reminds us that even the most enduring creations eventually evolve. The Empire's burden. Our journey through Rome's grand narrative has just begun, and already we've glimpsed the initial fissures, the very first cracks in that monumental edifice. Tonight, we shall continue to trace these early signs, delving deeper into the subtle forces that began to reshape the vast Roman world. You see, for centuries, particularly in its golden age, the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ, the Roman economy flourished. Picture rolling agricultural lands, bustling market towns, and the steady hum of commerce across a truly immense empire. Grain, wine, olive oil, these were the lifeblood, moving freely, filling coffers and supporting its legionaries. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity, a slow shift was occurring, almost imperceptible at first. Indeed, as time wore on, a growing burden began to fall upon the shoulders of the common folk. The goods and services produced by farmers, artisans, and merchants, once the engine of growth, were increasingly subjected to taxation. Imagine the cumulative effect of rising costs for production, for simply doing business, all contributing to a gradual but persistent increase in prices. What this meant is that Roman suppliers, faced with prices that perhaps didn't reflect their true costs, found themselves in a difficult position. They would, quite understandably, reduce or even cease production of goods whose prices were artificially suppressed. It was a subtle discouragement, perhaps, but one that echoed through the entire economic system. Now, coupled with these rising taxes, the very currency of the realm became less stable. You might be wondering what happens when coin of the realm loses its sure footing. Well, for merchants, both Roman and those from foreign lands, long-term planning became a perilous gamble. The dependable rhythms of trade began to falter when the value of the very money used for transactions was uncertain. Think of it like trying to build a lasting structure on shifting sand. Political uncertainty, too, often cast its long shadow, making any long-term investment within the empire feel increasingly precarious. Why commit resources, why plan for the future, when the very ground beneath your feet could shift at any moment? This isn't to say Rome was crumbling overnight, not yet. This was a slow, inexorable process, like a great river gradually eroding its banks. These weren't sudden, dramatic collapses, but rather a weakening at the foundations, a subtle undermining of the economic resilience that had once been Rome's great strength. The signs were there, if one knew where to look, in the archives of prices, in the dusty ledgers of trade, the whispers of change. Whispers of change. The empire's burden, what precisely was it composed of? We often hear of grand empires collapsing under the weight of external threats or perhaps the corrosion of internal strife. But Rome's story, as it slowly unravels, hints at something deeper, something almost imperceptible in its early stages. Imagine, if you will, a vast and ancient tree, seemingly robust, yet slowly being starved of the very nutrients it needs to thrive. Now, traditional narratives of Rome's decline often point to dramatic events, invading armies, the shifting sands of political power, or even the devastating whispers of disease. And while these elements certainly played their part, like sudden storms battering an aging tree, there was a more insidious force at work, a slow, systemic weakening from within. This was the long shadow of economic strain, an often overlooked companion to the more visible calamities. You see, the Roman economy, particularly in its earlier, more prosperous centuries, was largely fueled by agriculture. Yet over time, a subtle but profound shift began to occur. More and more of the goods and services produced by the diligent hands of farmers, artisans, and merchants began to be taxed. This wasn't merely a minor adjustment, it was a creeping burden, gradually increasing the costs of production and inevitably the prices of everything. Think of it as adding small, seemingly insignificant weights to a scale, one by one, until the delicate balance is irrevocably tipped. Retailers faced with these rising costs often found themselves in a difficult position. If the prices they could charge were artificially suppressed, perhaps by government action or market forces, their response was quite logical. They would reduce their output or even cease production altogether. Why continue to produce at a loss? This combination of escalating taxes and an increasingly unstable currency created a climate of profound uncertainty. It made long-term planning incredibly difficult for Roman merchants and indeed for their foreign trading partners. After all, if the value of your coinage might shift dramatically tomorrow, or if a new tax could suddenly appear, how could one confidently invest in the future? This political uncertainty, this unreliability in the economic landscape, made significant investment within Rome's vast borders increasingly risky. And so, the roots of the grand Roman tree, once so deeply embedded and drawing sustenance from fertile ground, began to wither, slowly, almost imperceptibly, contributing to its eventual long twilight. Legends lose grip. Indeed, some scholars argue that the economic vitality of the late Roman Empire, particularly in the 4th century, was far from what traditional narratives suggest. Through new archaeological research, especially the careful analysis of ancient pottery, a different picture begins to emerge. These findings, you see, indicate a period of robust agricultural activity, of high production from the fields, which seems to contradict the idea of widespread economic decay or a significant decline in population that some theories put forth. So if the internal economic decline wasn't as straightforward as once thought, what then accounts for the pressures that eventually overwhelmed the Western Empire? Here's where the changing dynamics beyond Rome's borders become profoundly important. Imagine the Roman world as a vast, magnificent pond. For centuries, smaller streams flowed into it, but suddenly the landscape around the pond itself began to shift dramatically. One significant shift was the rise of new powers, particularly the Sasanian Empire in Persia. In the 3rd century, this burgeoning superpower on Rome's eastern flank presented an unprecedented challenge. This wasn't merely a localized skirmish, it was a rivalry on an imperial scale, demanding that Rome divert a substantial portion of its military and financial resources eastward. This immense commitment to the eastern front, protecting against a formidable enemy, inevitably meant that the western borders were stretched thin, leaving them more vulnerable. To fund these vast military endeavors, new demands were placed upon the Roman treasury, often leading to increased taxation and a significant inflation in the currency, a desperate attempt, perhaps, to finance an ever-growing army. But the changes were not just in the east. Across the Rhine and Danube, in what was often termed Barbarian Europe, a quiet revolution was also unfolding. These communities, once seen as mere fringes of the civilized world, were experiencing their own period of growth. Agricultural production increased, trade expanded, and their populations rose. They were, in a way, evolving and becoming stronger, forming more cohesive and potent political structures, such as powerful coalitions of Franks and Goths. This transformation, you might wonder, wasn't entirely independent of Rome. In many subtle ways, it was stimulated by their very interactions with the empire itself, through trade, through diplomatic subsidies, and even through the demands of supplying the Roman legions stationed nearby. The very presence of Rome, then, inadvertently helped to forge the strength of those who would one day challenge it. Divide and conquer. Our journey through the twilight years of Rome brings us now to a nuanced understanding of its economic pulse, a rhythm that for many years historians believed had slowed to a near halt by the 4th century. However, recent archaeological findings, particularly in the humble remains of pottery shards, paint a rather different picture. These fragments, these everyday objects once used by farmers and merchants, suggest that the 4th century was, in fact, a period of immense agricultural activity. A time of high production and a thriving, rather than decaying, rural economy. Indeed, this challenges the long-held notion of widespread economic collapse and a significant decline in population during this era. Imagine it this way: instead of a vast, barren landscape, we see fields yielding bountiful harvests, a vibrant countryside teeming with life and labor. This economic vitality, this quiet hum of productivity, tells us that the internal economic engine of the empire was perhaps not failing as dramatically as once thought. So if the internal economy was not crumbling, what then was applying such immense pressure? Here we must turn our gaze eastward, to the rise of a formidable new power, the Sasanian Persians. In the 3rd century, Persia emerged as a superpower, a rival that forced Rome to redirect a significant portion of its military and fiscal resources to its eastern frontier. Think of it as a vast drawing down of strength from one arm to bolster another. This strategic shift inevitably weakened Rome's western borders, frontiers that would soon face their own formidable challenges. The cost of maintaining such a vast military presence, particularly against a strong adversary like Persia, was immense. To finance these legions, the empire resorted to measures that would have profound and lasting effects, actions that led to a kind of hyperinflation and political instability we call the crisis of the 3rd century. It wasn't an economic collapse in the sense of production ceasing, but rather an economic distortion, almost a desperate financial maneuver to keep the empire's vital organs functioning. The Roman state was, you see, engaged in an economic balancing act, attempting to sustain its military might through ever-increasing fiscal demands. Now, as Rome found itself preoccupied with this formidable eastern rival, another quiet revolution was taking place far beyond its established borders. In what the Romans termed Barbarian Europe, here economic vitality was also stirring. There was an increase in agricultural output, a blossoming of trade, and importantly, a growth in population. New, more sophisticated political structures, such as the coalitions of the Franks and the Goths, began to emerge. These transitions, these quiet awakenings, were partly stimulated by their interactions with Rome itself, through trade, diplomatic subsidies, and the very provisioning needs of the Roman legions. It's a curious echo, how Rome's own needs inadvertently fostered strength in its future adversaries. Barbarian at gates. The weight of the empire, you see, grew heavier with each passing year. As Rome expanded its reach, so too did its need for resources and for revenue. Initially in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the Roman economy thrived, largely thanks to its agricultural prowess. Vast fields tilled by countless hands produced an abundance that fueled the growing cities and legions. But even this abundance had its limits and its burdens. What began to happen, ever so subtly at first, was a gradual increase in taxation. Farmers, artisans, and merchants, they all found more and more of their efforts diverted to the state. This wasn't just a simple matter of paying a small percentage. It was a rising cost of doing business, a steady erosion of their profits. Think of it this way: when the cost of producing something, anything from a loaf of bread to a finely crafted tool, becomes too high, the producers begin to hesitate. Why create something if the rewards are constantly shrinking? So Roman suppliers, faced with these growing costs and often with prices dictated by the state, simply scaled back. They produced less, or sometimes they stopped altogether. This created a rather complex problem. Higher taxes, combined with an increasingly unstable currency, began to discourage trade. Imagine trying to plan for the future, to invest in a business or a new venture, when the value of your coinage fluctuates wildly, and the state demands more and more of your earnings. Roman merchants and their partners from distant lands found it incredibly difficult to make long-term plans across the sprawling empire. Political uncertainty, too, cast a long shadow, making long-term investments within Rome's borders feel increasingly risky. Why commit your resources, your ingenuity, when the future felt so precarious? So while the traditional narrative often points to military threats or perhaps the instability of emperors, the silent, pervasive force of economic strain was slowly but surely taking its toll. It was a gradual tightening of the economic noose, a lesson whispered through the ages about how governments, in their attempt to manage, can sometimes inadvertently stifle the very growth they seek to foster. Economic erosion deepens. The murmurs of the barbarians, their presence at the gates, as we discussed in our previous moments together, was not the sole, solitary thread unraveling the grand tapestry of Rome. Indeed, while external pressures certainly played their part, it is perhaps within the very fabric of Rome's daily life, its economy, its very way of governing, that we find some of the most profound and subtle reasons for its slow twilight. You see, the traditional narratives often speak of military threats, of political turmoil, or even moral decay. But perhaps we should look closer at the quiet arithmetic of its decline. What happens, for instance, when the costs of living, of doing business, become simply too burdensome for the ordinary citizen, the farmer, the merchant? too burdensome even for the mighty gears of an empire to bear, /and initially, the Roman economy, particularly in the 1st and 2nd centuries of our common era, thrived, often due to robust agricultural growth. Imperial expansion, new lands, new resources, a fertile ground for prosperity, if you will. Yet over time, a creeping change began to take hold. An increasing amount of what was produced, the grain from the fields, the pottery from the kilns, the cloth woven by diligent hands, all became subject to greater and greater taxation. Imagine, if you will, the burden this placed upon those who labored. Rising costs of production, coupled with the friction of transactions, led inevitably to higher prices. And what happens when prices are artificially held low, perhaps by imperial decree, while the expenses soar? Suppliers, those very farmers and craftsmen whose work sustained the empire, would either produce less, or cease production altogether for those goods, finding little incentive to continue. And this mounting taxation, I imagine, combined with an ever-unstable currency, quietly discouraged the very act of commerce itself. How does a merchant plan for the coming seasons, for journeys across the vast expanse of the empire, when the value of the coins in their purse might shift dramatically, seemingly overnight? Long-term planning, the very backbone of stable trade and investment, became fraught with peril. Political uncertainty, too, cast its long shadow, making any significant long-term investment within Rome feel increasingly risky. Why commit your resources, your talent, your time, when the ground beneath your feet feels ever more unsteady? And what is truly fascinating is that this slow economic erosion was not always a sign of overt collapse. Indeed, some modern archaeological insights, particularly from the extensive study of ancient ceramics, suggest that the 4th century was, in many regions, a period of maximum agricultural activity, a time of high yields. This challenges earlier assumptions of a universal economic crisis or a drastic decline in population. It suggests, perhaps, that the issue was not necessarily a lack of production, but rather how that production was managed, how it was taxed, and how its fruits were distributed within the increasingly fractured structure of the empire. The wealth was there, you see, but its flow, its very lifeblood, was becoming constricted. And here, in these silent economic shifts, in these almost imperceptible changes to the daily lives of its people, lay a profound vulnerability. A quiet prelude to the much grander, more dramatic events that were yet to unfold. Christianity's quiet rise. The economic erosion, which we touched upon, deepened further, exacerbated by a shift in state policy. For centuries, the Roman economy, particularly during the 1st and 2nd centuries, had thrived on agricultural growth. Fields bloomed, trade routes bustled, and prosperity in many ways defined the era. Yet as the empire aged, a subtle, almost imperceptible change began to take hold, one that would have profound consequences. You see, an increasing portion of the goods and services produced by humble farmers, dedicated artisans, and shrewd merchants fell under the ever-widening gaze of the tax collector. What might seem like a simple adjustment, a modest increase here and there, had a cumulative effect. The cost of producing these vital goods and the cost of bringing them to market steadily climbed, and as these costs rose, so too did prices. Now, here's what's interesting. Roman suppliers often found themselves in a difficult position. When the government artificially suppressed prices, intending perhaps to keep things affordable for the populace, these suppliers faced a choice. They could continue to produce goods at a loss, or they could simply stop. Many chose the latter, withdrawing their goods from the market entirely or significantly curtailing production. This, of course, meant less to go around and often higher prices for those who could still find what they needed. Consider this for a moment. Higher taxes combined with unstable currency created a climate deeply discouraging to trade. Imagine trying to plan for the future, to invest in new ventures, or even just to maintain your current business. When the value of your money fluctuates wildly and a larger portion of your earnings is claimed by the state. Roman merchants and their counterparts beyond the empire's borders found it increasingly difficult to engage in long-term planning. The very act of enterprise, that spark of innovation and exchange, was dampened. The political uncertainty we've discussed only compounded these economic woes. Long-term investments within Rome's vast territories became increasingly risky. Why commit your resources, your time, and your effort to ventures that might be swept away by political turmoil or unpredictable policy shifts? It's a question that echoes through time, one that asks, where is the safest harbor for one's wealth and efforts when the winds of change blow so fiercely? This period, often viewed through the lens of military threats and governmental instability, was at its heart also a profound economic story. It illustrates with great clarity the delicate balance between the state and the sustenance of its people, a balance that in Rome was becoming perilously and perhaps irreversibly undone. It truly is a testament to how governments can, in theory, foster economic prosperity, or inadvertently stifle it. The empire's very foundation, its economic vitality, was being worn away, stone by painstaking stone. The sack of Rome. The subtle shift in the empire's foundations was not solely a matter of faith or changing beliefs. Indeed, a far more terrestrial force was at play, one that gnawed at the very sinews of Rome's prodigious strength, its economy. For centuries, Rome had thrived, much of its prosperity built upon the back of its bountiful agricultural output during the 1st and 2nd centuries. But as time wore on, a creeping transformation began to take hold. Imagine a great, vibrant tree. Its roots once drew sustenance freely from the earth. Yet slowly these roots find themselves ensnared, constricted by an ever-tightening net. More and more, the goods and services produced by the diligent farmers, the skilled artisans, and the bustling merchants found themselves burdened by ever-increasing taxation. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event, but rather a gradual intensification, a slow weight pressing down. As the costs of production and the expense of simply doing business rose, so too did prices. Here's what's interesting. Rather than stimulating more trade, this often had the opposite effect. Roman suppliers, faced with prices that were artificially suppressed or too heavily taxed, simply chose to limit their output, or in some cases ceased production altogether. What good is toil, after all, if the fruit of your labor is diminished to naught? Higher taxes, coupled with an increasingly unstable currency, a kind of inflationary malaise, began to chip away at the very incentive for commercial exchange. It made long-term planning, for merchants both within the empire and those from afar, a perilous gamble. Imagine trying to build a lasting enterprise when the very value of your coins seems to melt away with each passing season. Political uncertainties only exacerbated this economic anxiety, making large-scale, long-term investments within Rome seem increasingly precarious. Now, traditionally, explanations for Rome's decline often point to military threats or political instability, perhaps even moral decay, and these certainly played their part, but what's often overlooked or perhaps undervalued are these profound, long-term economic maladies. Peter Heather, a scholar whose work sheds a different light on these twilight years, even suggests that the later Roman Empire, contrary to popular belief, maintained a degree of economic vitality into the 4th century. Archaeological evidence, particularly from the extensive analysis of pottery, points to maximum agricultural activity during this period. This doesn't suggest a widespread economic collapse, but rather a shift in the pressures that afflicted it. So, while the internal economic structures were indeed under immense strain, it is perhaps more accurate to view it as a deep, systemic challenge, rather than a sudden, catastrophic failure born purely from internal rot. What truly crippled Rome, as we shall see, was not just a failing within, but a rising tide of power and transformation from beyond its storied borders. Western Empire crumbles. Now, as we slowly draw back the curtain on this vast historical stage, we come to a subtle yet profound shift, the economic underpinnings of the empire. You see, the traditional narratives often speak of grand battles, political intrigue, and moral decay when discussing Rome's twilight, yet perchance the whisper of economics tells an equally compelling, if often overlooked, tale. From the very dawn of its expansive reach, the Roman economy, particularly in its golden age of the 1st and 2nd centuries, thrived on a flourishing agricultural output. Grain and wine, oil and timber, the bounty of the land fueled its growth, but as the centuries wore on, a creeping change began to take hold. Imagine, if you will, the burden of growing taxation. More and more of the goods and services produced by the diligent farmers, the skilled artisans, and the resourceful merchants found themselves subject to the emperor's levy. This ever-increasing cost of production, coupled with the friction of transactions, inevitably led to rising prices throughout the vast marketplace. What happened then, you ask? Well, it is a simple, rather human reaction. Roman suppliers, faced with prices artificially suppressed or heavily taxed, chose the path of least resistance. They began to limit or even cease the production of those very goods. Why toil if the reward diminishes? This confluence of higher taxes and a currency that sadly grew increasingly unstable made the very act of commerce a precarious affair. How could a merchant plan for the long term, spanning the breadth of the empire, when the value of his coins was ever shifting, like sands in the desert? This dance of uncertainty, this political capriciousness, if you will, rendered long-term investments within Rome's borders increasingly perilous. Few would risk their fortunes when stability itself seemed an illusion, and so, the very engine of growth that had once propelled Rome to its dazzling heights began to sputter, not with a sudden catastrophic explosion, but with a slow, deliberate winding down. It is a potent lesson indeed about the delicate balance between state and commerce, a balance that, when disrupted, can erode the foundations of even the grandest of empires. The threads of economic life, it seems, are woven intricately into the tapestry of history. Eastern sun rises. Yet the story of Rome's decline is far deeper than mere political instability or military encounters. Indeed, beneath the surface of battles and emperors, a more insidious force was at work, the slow corrosion of its economic foundations. You see, while we often focus on the dramatic sieges and the larger-than-life figures, the everyday choices concerning wealth and its management played a pivotal, if often overlooked, role in shaping the empire's destiny. Imagine, if you will, a vast engine, immensely powerful, but gradually starved of its essential fuel. That, in essence, was the Roman economy in its later centuries. Initially, especially during the 1st and 2nd centuries of the empire, Rome's economic engine hummed with surprising efficiency. Agriculture flourished, providing the very bedrock for its prosperity. Fields yielded bountiful harvests, and trade routes, secured by Roman legions, allowed goods and ideas to flow with relative freedom. But like a deep river that silently changes its course, the currents shifted. Over time, an increasing share of the wealth generated by the common farmer, the skilled artisan, and the resourceful merchant found its way into the imperial coffers through ever-increasing taxation. What this meant was a quiet burden growing heavier with each passing year. The costs of producing goods and engaging in trade began to rise significantly. Think of it from the perspective of a Roman potter, for instance. Each pot he crafted, each journey he made to market became more expensive, not because of the clay or his skill, but because of the taxes levied upon his labor and his sales. This pressure often led suppliers to either curtail their production or, in some cases, cease it entirely, particularly when the state attempted to artificially control prices. Here's where the intricate tapestry of cause and effect becomes truly vivid. High taxes, compounded by an increasingly unstable currency, began to actively discourage trade. How could a merchant plan for the long term across such a vast empire when the value of the coins in his hand might fluctuate wildly from one month to the next? This financial uncertainty, paired with the ever-present political instability, transformed long-term investments in Rome into increasingly risky ventures. Who indeed would sow seeds for a harvest years away if the ground beneath them felt uncertain? This economic quandary illustrates a profound historical lesson: how governments, through their policies, can either foster flourishing prosperity or, quite unintentionally, sow the seeds of decline. The Roman experience in this regard serves as a poignant example, illuminating the delicate balance between supporting economic growth and inadvertently stifling it through overreach. It's a story of resources, once abundant, slowly being squandered, creating a subtle, systemic weakness that no amount of military might could ultimately overcome. Loss of identity. We have explored how the eastern sun began to rise, shifting the axis of Roman power. But you see, the vastness of the empire, its very scale, brought with it a cascade of internal struggles that slowly yet inexorably began to pull it apart. Imagine a grand and intricate tapestry woven over centuries. For a long time the threads held strong, creating a magnificent picture. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, certain threads began to fray, weakened by unseen pressures. One such pressure was the economic strain, a subtle, yet pervasive decay that gnawed at the foundations of Roman life. Initially, the Roman economy, particularly in the 1st and 2nd centuries, thrived on agricultural growth, the bounty of the land feeding its grand ambitions. But over time, the very success of this system began to generate new challenges. More and more of the goods and services produced by farmers, artisans, and merchants were subjected to an ever-increasing burden of taxation. What this meant, in essence, was that the cost of doing business, of simply producing something for the market, steadily climbed. And as we know, when costs rise, prices often follow. Now suppliers, faced with these artificially depressed prices, sometimes mandated by the state itself, reacted in the most logical way they could. They reduced or even halted the production of these goods. Why toil and produce if the reward is minimal or even a loss? This interplay between rising taxes and an unstable currency, a currency that often lost its value even as you held it, created a profound disincentive for trade. How could a Roman merchant, or indeed their foreign counterparts, plan for the long term? How could they make significant investments if the very value of their money was uncertain and the political landscape was equally unpredictable? Long-term investments in such an environment became, understandably, increasingly perilous. This is not to say that the empire was collapsing from within, an internal rot entirely of its own making. Scholars like Peter Heather challenged this traditional view, suggesting that the late Roman Empire, particularly in the 4th century, was surprisingly vital economically. New archaeological findings through the careful study of pottery, for instance, indicate a period of maximal agricultural activity and high rural production. This paints a different picture, one where the empire was not necessarily in a state of universal economic crisis or marked by a significant population decline. No, the story here becomes more nuanced. The crisis of the 3rd century, characterized by soaring inflation and political instability, wasn't necessarily a sign of economic collapse, but rather a reflection of the rising power of the Sasanian Empire in Persia. This formidable new rival forced Rome to divert a significant portion of its military and fiscal resources eastward, weakening its western borders. This increased demand for its armies, in turn, drove the very inflation intended to finance these military endeavors. It's a complex dance, isn't it? The external pressures causing internal reverberations. You might almost see it as a kind of imperial Newton's third law. Every imperial action generates an opposite and equal reaction among its neighbors, sometimes leading, ultimately, to its own undoing. And these pressures, they would soon begin to reshape the very fabric of daily life within the empire, a story we shall unravel in our next contemplation. Everyday life changes. So we've explored the fading echoes of Roman identity, how that sense of shared purpose began to fray. But this internal weakening was but one thread in a much larger, more intricate tapestry of decline. For as Rome grappled with its own soul, a relentless external pressure was building forces that would reshape the very meaning of empire. You see, the shadow of external threats, always present, began to lengthen considerably, demanding more and more from an already weary state. Imagine, if you will, the vast borders of the Roman Empire. Stretching for thousands of miles, to protect such an expanse required an army of immense size and unwavering loyalty. Yet year by year, the cost of maintaining this formidable shield grew heavier. Higher taxes were levied upon the very people who were already struggling under the weight of an unstable economy, and what's particularly fascinating is how this burden, intended to secure the empire, often exacerbated its internal fragilities. Indeed, the concept of a constant, overwhelming military expenditure is crucial here. Not only did Rome have to defend against various barbarian tribes along its European frontiers, but a new, formidable rival had risen in the east, the Sassanid Persians. This was no mere skirmish. This was a wrestling match between superpowers, diverting vast resources and legions eastward, often at the expense of the western provinces. It was a strategic dilemma of immense proportions, weakening one flank to protect another. What this meant for the common Roman citizen, especially in the West, was a landscape defined by increasing instability and a pervasive sense of threat. Communities once thriving found themselves perpetually on edge, caught between the demands of the imperial tax collector and the very real danger of incursions. The old promises of Roman peace and security began to sound hollow to many, as the resources needed to deliver them were stretched thin, battling foes on multiple fronts. It's a stark reminder, isn't it, of how even the mightiest structures can begin to buckle under sustained, unrelenting pressure. The Shadow Lengthens. The economy of Rome, particularly in its earlier, more vigorous centuries, was largely driven by a robust agricultural sector. Vast fields, tilled by countless hands, produced the sustenance that fed the legions in the cities. But over time, a subtle yet profound shift began to occur. You see, the blessings of these bountiful harvests slowly became burdens, as more and more of the goods and services produced by humble farmers, skilled artisans, and ambitious merchants were increasingly taxed. Imagine, if you will, the ripple effect of this. As the cost of producing goods rose, both from the effort required and these ever-increasing levies, so too did prices. This wasn't a sustainable path. Think of a baker, for instance, who finds the price of flour and yeast and the taxes on his bread climbing steadily year after year. Eventually, he might choose to make less bread, or perhaps none at all if the margins become too thin to justify the toil. Roman suppliers reacted in much the same way, gradually curtailing or entirely halting the production of goods whose prices were artificially suppressed by these economic pressures. This intricate dance between rising taxes and a subtly destabilized currency greatly discouraged trade. Roman merchants who once navigated the seas and roads with relative certainty found long-term planning increasingly fraught with peril. Their foreign partners, too, became wary. The once clear pathways of commerce became clouded with uncertainty. How could one confidently invest in ventures spanning years and vast distances, when the value of the very money exchanged might fluctuate wildly without warning? Political instability, which we have touched upon, merely compounded this problem, making any long-term investment within the empire a gamble few were willing to take. Now, here's what's interesting. While the internal economic woes were certainly a factor, Some historians suggest that the late Roman Empire, particularly the 4th century, was far more economically vital than traditionally believed. Archaeological evidence, from the humble shards of pottery to the remnants of ancient fields, points to a period of maximal agricultural activity and high rural production. This paints a different picture, one where the internal economic engine was still performing, if somewhat roughly. So if the economy wasn't entirely collapsing from within, what truly turned the tide? Perhaps it was a delicate balance of internal stress meeting external force. The very act of empire building, you see, often creates its own counterreactions, a sort of historical Newton's third law. The rise of a new superpower to the east, the Sasanian Persians, forced Rome to reallocate its vast military and financial resources. This shift inevitably weakened the western frontiers, creating a vacuum that new, powerful external forces were only too eager to fill. The needs of a constantly engaged army, in turn, led to further inflation as the empire strained to finance its formidable military machine. Last emperor's fall. Our journey through the twilight of Rome brings us now to a nuanced understanding of its economic landscape. You see, it wasn't a sudden collapse of wealth, but a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of its foundations. Imagine a magnificent old tree, its roots, once vibrant and deep, slowly losing their grip on the soil. The tree might still stand tall for a time, even produce fruit, but its underlying strength is diminishing. This, in essence, was the Roman economy in its later centuries. Indeed, traditional narratives often paint a picture of internal decay, of economic ruin, widespread poverty, and a dwindling population. Yet new archaeological whispers, sifted from the dust of forgotten cities and the fragments of everyday pottery, suggest something rather different. Studies of ceramic distribution, for instance, point to a surprising vitality in the 4th century, a period of maximum agricultural activity, with the fields yielding bountiful harvests. So the picture of a universally impoverished, depopulated empire, perhaps, is not entirely accurate. The West, it seems, was not simply failing from within. But if not internal economic collapse, then what? Here the gaze shifts eastward towards the formidable rise of Sasanian Persia. The 3rd century, a time marked by hyperinflation and political instability, was not primarily due to economic breakdown in the West, but rather to the immense military and fiscal strain imposed by this new superpower. Rome was forced to divert vast resources, its legions, its gold, its very attention, to the eastern frontier, leaving its western defenses exposed and vulnerable. This shift, this draining of resources, led to an increased demand for maintaining a larger army. And how did Rome finance this colossal undertaking? Often through the debasement of its currency, a practice that, as we've discussed, inevitably leads to inflation. It was a desperate measure, a necessary evil to fund the very defense of the empire, but one that subtly undermined the economic stability of the common citizen and the merchant alike. The shadow of Persia, though far from Rome itself, cast a long financial pall over the entire empire. And simultaneously, beyond the Roman frontiers, in what was once called Barbarian Europe, a quiet revolution was unfolding. Agricultural production was increasing, trade networks were expanding, and populations were growing. New, more centralized political structures began to emerge among peoples like the Franks and the Goths. These transformations were not entirely independent of Rome. Trade with the empire, diplomatic subsidies, and the very provisioning of Roman legions all played a hand in stimulating this growth. It was, you might say, the unforeseen consequence of Rome's vast reach, its own interactions inadvertently strengthening those beyond its borders. So, the imperial efforts meant to secure its sway inadvertently carved out paths for new powers to rise. A new world dawns. The cost of maintaining this vast apparatus, this mighty military and bureaucratic machine, increasingly fell upon the land itself and upon the backs of those who worked it. You see, the Roman economy, for much of its golden age, particularly in the 1st and 2nd centuries, had thrived on agriculture. It was the bedrock, the very foundation of their prosperity. But as time wore on, as the demands of the state grew, more and more of the goods and services produced by farmers, artisans, and merchants became subject to taxation. It was a slow, creeping process, almost imperceptible at first, like the erosion of a riverbank over many seasons. What happened then was rather predictable. The growing cost of production, coupled with the increasing transaction fees imposed by the state, led to a general rise in prices. Roman suppliers, those who produced the very goods the empire needed, found themselves in a difficult position. If the prices they could charge were artificially suppressed, or if the burden of taxes made their efforts unprofitable, they simply reduced or even ceased their production altogether. Imagine, if you will, a baker who finds that the wheat is too expensive, the taxes on his flour too high, and the price he can fetch for his bread too low to justify his labor. He might simply stop baking. Combined with an increasingly unstable currency, these higher taxes began to discourage trade. Roman merchants and their partners from beyond the empire's borders found it ever more challenging to plan for the long term. Instability, both political and economic, made any significant investment in Rome a venture fraught with peril. Why plan a new vineyard or embark on a distant trading voyage if the rules of the game might change overnight, or the value of your earnings erode before they even reached your coffers? This is important because it illustrates a profound truth about governance and prosperity. The Roman Empire, in this twilight of its western half, became an example of how a government, however well-intentioned, can inadvertently stifle the very economic growth it needs to survive. The constant pressure of higher taxes, the instability of the currency, and the growing risks associated with investment. These were not dramatic, sudden blows, but rather continuous, subtle erosions that weaken the empire from within, much like rust silently corrodes iron. It underscores how the interaction between government action and economic reality can either foster or hinder the flowering of a civilization. Legacy of stone. The echoes of military campaigns and political struggles often dominate our understanding of Rome's decline. But beneath that grand tapestry of events, a quieter yet profoundly influential force was at play: economics. You see, the long arc of this empire's story is not just one of emperors and armies, but also of merchants, farmers, and the subtle, steady pressure of fiscal policy. What's particularly interesting is how modern scholarship has begun to re-examine these economic undercurrents. For a long time, many believed that the Roman economy, especially in its later Western period, was simply crumbling from within, a sort of slow decay. Yet, archaeological findings, particularly the careful study of everyday pottery, suggest a different story for the 4th century. They indicate a surprisingly robust agricultural sector, with high levels of production. This challenges the notion of a widespread economic crisis or a significant drop in population during that specific time. So, if the internal economy of the 4th century West wasn't inherently collapsing, what then were these economic pressures? Imagine, if you will, the burden placed upon the very engine of the empire, its people. As the state's needs grew, driven largely, as we now understand, by external pressures, more and more of the goods and services produced by humble farmers, diligent artisans, and busy merchants became subject to taxation. This increasing weight of taxes, coupled with rising production and transaction costs, inevitably pushed prices higher. Picture a Roman supplier. Perhaps a potter whose wares were now taxed at every turn. Faced with artificially suppressed prices for his goods, yet rising costs to produce them, he might choose to reduce his output, or perhaps cease making certain items altogether. This kind of discouragement soon spread through the marketplace. Now, here's where it truly complicated matters. The currency itself was becoming unstable. High taxes combined with this fluctuating monetary value made long-term commercial planning exceedingly difficult. Roman merchants and their foreign counterparts found it harder to anticipate future costs or profits across the vast expanse of the empire. This uncertainty, you see, was like a silent rust eating away at the gears of commerce. Investment, the very lifeblood of a growing economy, became increasingly risky within Roman borders. Why commit resources when the political landscape shifted so dramatically, and the value of your coin could plummet with little warning? It was this intricate dance between external military needs, internal fiscal policies, and the resulting economic disincentives that quietly, yet powerfully, reshaped the destiny of the Western Empire. Lessons from decline. Indeed, this economic vitality of the late Roman Empire, particularly in the 4th century, challenges some of our long-held assumptions. Archaeological evidence, especially from the slow, painstaking analysis of pottery shards, suggests that this was a period of robust agricultural activity, a time of high crop yields and thriving production. This silent testimony from the earth itself seems to contradict the notion of a widespread economic collapse or a drastic decline in population. You see, the Roman world was far more resilient than we often imagine. Yet the crisis of the 3rd century, a tumultuous era marked by hyperinflation and political instability, wasn't a sudden internal implosion. Instead, it seems to have been ignited by a formidable external force: the rise of the Sasanian Empire in neighboring Persia. This new, powerful rival on Rome's eastern frontier compelled the empire to divert an immense portion of its military and fiscal resources eastward. Imagine the strain this placed on the vast Roman system. The constant demand for soldiers, for supplies, for fortifications. It was this monumental shift in focus that in turn fueled the inflation. Rome needed to finance its legions, and the easiest, quickest way to do so was to debase its currency. But as we've discussed before, such measures carry a heavy, hidden cost. While Rome poured its strength into containing the Sasanian threat, a quieter, yet equally profound transformation was unfolding in the lands beyond its northern borders. In what we often call barbarian Europe, a new economic revolution was taking root. Agricultural output was increasing, trade networks were expanding, and populations were growing. New, more sophisticated political entities were beginning to emerge, powerful coalitions, perhaps like the Franks or the Goths. These transformations, interestingly enough, were not entirely independent of Rome. They were in part stimulated by constant interaction with the empire itself, through trade, through diplomatic subsidies, and through the sheer demand for resources to supply Rome's ever-present armies. It's almost as if Rome, in its very interactions, was inadvertently fostering the strength of its future challengers. And here's where we encounter what some historians have called the third law of motion in empires. Think of it this way: for every imperial action, there is often an equal and opposite reaction among its neighbors. Rome's imperial ascendancy, its sheer power and influence, inevitably generated powerful counterforces. Both the Sasanian Empire in the east and these emerging, barbarian peoples in the north were, in a sense, products of Rome's own vast reach. Forces that eventually contributed to its profound reshaping. Echoes of Rome. Indeed, as we reflect upon the lessons gleaned from the twilight of Rome, a rather crucial question naturally arises. A question that echoes through the ages and has fascinated historians for centuries. Why do empires, vast and seemingly immutable, eventually come to an end? You see, while we've spoken of the intricate dance between internal strife and external pressures, the barbarian incursions, the economic instabilities, the administrative decay, it's worth considering these elements not merely as isolated incidents, but rather as threads in a much larger tapestry. Think of a grand, ancient tree, its roots delving deep, its branches reaching wide. The fall of an empire, like the felling of such a tree, is rarely due to a single axe blow. Instead, it's often the culmination of many seasons of subtle rot, persistent burrowing insects, and perhaps a few powerful storms that finally bring it down. Historians, much like diligent archaeologists, sift through the dust of time, trying to discern the precise sequence of events, the underlying causes, and the ultimate tipping points. Some, like the venerable Edward Gibbon, perceived an inherent fragility, a decay born from within, perhaps the adoption of Christianity, as he controversially suggested, or a general moral decline. Others, more recently, have looked outwards, arguing that external forces were the true catalysts. Imagine the rise of the Sasanian Empire in Persia, for instance, a formidable rival that consistently drew Roman resources eastward, leaving its western flanks exposed. Or consider the profound economic and political transformations occurring in Europe beyond Rome's immediate borders, with Germanic tribes developing more sophisticated, and indeed more threatening, political structures. What's particularly intriguing is the sheer interplay between these perspectives. While Rome certainly faced its internal challenges, the growing schism between rich and poor, the dependency on slave labor, the political corruption within the Senate, these internal vulnerabilities often became magnified by external pressures. It's akin to a body with a pre-existing condition, suddenly exposed to a harsh environment. The condition itself might not be immediately fatal, but coupled with the environmental stress, it becomes precarious. And then there is the notion of the third law of Newton in empires, a fascinating concept suggesting that an empire's very expansion, its exertion of power, inevitably generates an equal and opposite reaction among its neighbors. Rome, by its very nature, shaped the world around it, fostering economic activity and inadvertently creating powerful entities that would one day challenge its supremacy. This isn't to say Rome caused its own demise in a simplistic sense, but rather that its dynamic influence had far-reaching and often unforeseen consequences. The arrival of the Huns in Europe, for example, a sudden and unexpected seismic event, triggered a cascade of migrations, pushing Germanic peoples, already transformed and strengthened by their interactions with Rome, deep into the empire's territories. The fall of empires, seldom a neat, singular event. Instead, it's a mosaic of interconnected failures and profound shifts, a long, drawn-out process where no one factor stands entirely alone. Why empires end? Our journey through the twilight years of Rome has led us through military changes and political shifts, but to truly understand the full tapestry of its decline, we must also consider the subtle, yet profound, currents of economic transformation. Imagine, if you will, the vast circulatory system of a complex organism. If that system begins to falter, quietly at first, the entire body eventually suffers. Historically, the Roman economy, particularly in its earlier centuries, thrived on a robust agricultural base. Farmers, artisans, and merchants fueled a vibrant flow of goods and services across the vast Mediterranean world. Yet as the centuries wore on, a gradual, insidious shift began to take hold. More and more of the wealth generated by ordinary people, the humble peasant, the skilled craftsman, the bustling trader, became subject to taxation. It was a slow, steady increase, a constant drawing of resources from the very heart of economic activity. This rising tide of taxation had a corrosive effect. When the cost of producing goods increased due to these levies, prices naturally rose. In response, many Roman suppliers found themselves in an unenviable position. If the prices they could command were artificially suppressed, or if the costs of production became too burdensome, they simply produced less, or ceased altogether. It's a fundamental principle, you see. If the reward for effort diminishes, so too does the effort itself. The cumulative effect of higher taxes, combined with an increasingly unstable currency, sometimes debased, sometimes erratic, created an environment profoundly discouraging to trade. Consider the Roman merchant, or indeed his foreign counterpart. How could they plan for the long term? How could they make investments, knowing that the value of their currency might shift unpredictably, or that their profits might be swallowed by ever-growing state demands? Political uncertainty, too, cast its long shadow. Long-term investments, the very bedrock of a thriving economy, became increasingly risky propositions within the empire's borders. What this means is that the Roman state, perhaps inadvertently, began to stifle the very economic growth it once fostered. The incentives for productive labor diminished, the mechanisms of trade became unreliable, and the foundation of wealth began to erode. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but rather a slow, almost imperceptible draining of vitality, like a great river whose many tributaries gradually begin to run dry. It's a powerful lesson from the archives of time, illustrating how governments, with the best of intentions perhaps, can sometimes fail to support the very economic stability and growth that sustains them. The unseen currents. We have explored the multitude of reasons why empires, much like grand ancient trees, eventually reach their twilight years and begin their slow decline. But perhaps we have been too quick to assume a uniform end for mighty Rome. Indeed, not all falls are sudden, dramatic collapses, as one might imagine from watching tales unfold on a grand cinematic screen. Often the end is far more nuanced, a gentle unraveling, almost imperceptible in its early stages. Consider the very vastness of the Roman Empire. Initially, its economy, particularly in the 1st and 2nd centuries, thrived on agricultural growth. Fields stretched for miles, yielding bountiful harvests that fed its legions and its burgeoning cities. Yet over time, a subtle shift began to occur. More and more of the goods and services produced by the ordinary farmer, the diligent artisan, and the resourceful merchant found themselves burdened by ever-increasing taxes. This might seem a small thing, a mere administrative adjustment. But the cumulative effect was profound. The rising costs of production, coupled with these increased taxes, inevitably led to higher prices. What happens, you might wonder, when the cost of bringing something to market becomes too great? Well, the Roman suppliers, these steadfast producers, often responded by simply reducing their output, or in some cases ceasing to produce certain goods altogether. Why toil and struggle if the reward is continually eaten away? This, in turn, created scarcity. A quiet, insidious erosion of the economic bedrock. High taxes paired with an increasingly unstable currency, imagine money that seems to lose a little of its worth each year, made trade and long-term planning a dangerous gamble. Roman merchants and their foreign counterparts found it increasingly difficult to chart a secure path across the empire. Indeed, Peter Heather, a rather astute scholar of the Roman world, challenges the conventional wisdom that painted a picture of internal economic decay in the 4th century. Archaeological evidence, particularly from mundane things like pottery, suggests that this period, far from being one of decline, actually saw maximum agricultural activity and productivity. This suggests that the internal structures were perhaps not as brittle as once thought, yet the pressure was certainly mounting, so it wasn't always a sudden economic earthquake as one might assume. Instead, think of it as countless small streams, each carrying away a tiny grain of sand from a mighty riverbank. Eventually, slowly, imperceptibly, the bank itself begins to recede. What this means, you see, is that the Roman West, in particular, found itself besieged by a confluence of these subtle economic pressures, alongside the external threats we often hear so much about. It wasn't merely the grandeur of its military might that crumbled, but the very foundations of its economy that softened over a span of centuries. A gentle demise. Now we have spoken of the internal currents that eroded the Roman Empire, economic woes, political intrigue, and the shifting sands of its very foundations. But history, like a great river, is also shaped by external forces, by the tributaries and the storms that arise beyond its immediate banks. And for Rome, one of the most significant external forces that challenged its very existence was the rise of new powers beyond its borders. You see, for centuries, Rome had been the undisputed hegemon. Its legions were unmatched, its wealth seemingly endless, but in the grand tapestry of time, no empire exists in a vacuum. As Rome grew, so too did the seeds of potential challengers, nurtured by their own ambitions and the very interactions they had with the mighty empire. Consider for a moment the East. For many years, Rome's primary rival there had been the Parthian Empire. Yet in the 3rd century AD, a new and formidable power emerged from its ashes, the Sasanian Persian Empire. This was no mere successor state. This was a resurgent, militarily potent entity, imbued with a powerful sense of its own imperial destiny. The Sassanids proved to be a far more demanding adversary than any Rome had faced in the East for centuries. Their rise necessitated a massive redeployment of Roman resources, forcing the bulk of its legions and its treasury to the eastern frontiers. This continuous, draining conflict had profound repercussions, especially for the western half of the empire, and it was not only in the east that the landscape was changing. Beyond the northern frontiers, in what Rome often dismissively called Barbaria, a quiet but profound transformation was occurring. Archaeological evidence, particularly from the study of pottery and settlement patterns, suggests that far from being static or primitive, many of these Germanic peoples were experiencing their own periods of economic growth. Agricultural production increased, trade intensified, and their populations swelled. New, more sophisticated political structures began to emerge among them, powerful confederations like the Franks and the Goths, who were not simple tribes but increasingly coherent and formidable entities. These transformations were, in a curious way, partly stimulated by their very proximity and interaction with Rome. Trade, the allure of Roman wealth, diplomatic subsidies, and the constant need to supply Roman armies along the frontiers all played a part in accelerating their development. It's almost as if Rome, in its immense gravity, inadvertently pulled these neighboring peoples into a more complex and dynamic orbit, inadvertently strengthening them. What we are witnessing here, perhaps, is a historical echo of Newton's third law. For every imperial action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Rome's own expansion, its very dominance, generated powerful counterforces among its neighbors. The rise of Persia in the east and the economic and political maturation of the Germanic peoples to the north created a shifting geopolitical chessboard upon which Rome would increasingly find itself on the defensive. These external pressures, combined with the internal fragilities we have already discussed, woven together, formed an intricate pattern of decline. It is a slow, almost imperceptible drift, a vast current carrying the great ship of empire towards an unseen horizon. Drifting into dusk. The echoes of Rome's military strength and political ambition carried across vast stretches of land for centuries. Yet beneath the surface of this grand edifice, economic currents were shifting, subtly at first, then with increasing force, eroding the very bedrock of the empire. You see, the traditional narratives often speak of barbarian invasions or moral decay. But the quiet truth, as history often reveals, lies just as much in the ledger books and the marketplace. Initially, in its golden ages of the 1st and 2nd centuries, Rome's economy thrived through agriculture. Farmers, artisans, and merchants produced goods and services, and the system, though imperfect, largely functioned. But as time wore on, the burden of taxation grew heavier. Imagine, if you will, a farmer working his fields from dawn till dusk, only to find an ever larger portion of his harvest claimed by the imperial tax collectors. This rising cost of production, coupled with the instability of the currency itself, began to discourage commerce. Why produce, why trade, when the rewards are so diminished and the future so uncertain? Roman merchants and their partners from distant lands found it increasingly difficult to plan for the long term. The value of a coin today might be drastically different tomorrow, making large investments or long journeys fraught with peril. Political instability, too, played its part, weaving a complex tapestry of risk that made investments within the empire less and less appealing. It's a fascinating study, really. How a government meant to foster prosperity can, through its own policies, inadvertently stifle the very economic lifeblood it relies upon. Now, contrary to some older views about economic decline in the 4th century, fresh archaeological evidence, particularly from the study of pottery, paints a different picture. It suggests that this period, in fact, saw a peak in agricultural activity and production. This isn't a story of outright economic collapse, but rather a redistribution and a drain on resources. The persistent demands of supporting a vast military, particularly to fend off the rising power of Persia in the east, pulled immense wealth and manpower away from the west. Think of it as a constant, slow bleed, even as the heart itself still beats strongly. This necessity to fund an ever larger army against ever more formidable foes ultimately fueled the very inflation that helped destabilize the economy. It's a delicate balance, indeed, between security and economic health. The long goodbye. The weight of all these pressures, the economic strain, the external threats, the internal divisions, began to settle heavily upon the Western Empire. You see, while the East, with its vibrant trade and strategic capital of Constantinople, navigated these challenges with a certain resilience, the West found itself increasingly beleaguered. Imagine, if you will, two halves of a vast, ancient ship sailing through a tempest. One half, meticulously maintained and skillfully piloted, manages to stay afloat, adapting to the raging seas. The other, however, begins to take on water, buffeted by endless waves, its timbers groaning under the strain. The critical year, the one etched into the annals of history, became 476 AD. This was not a sudden cataclysm, nor a dramatic battle fought on a grand scale. Instead, it was an almost quiet shifting of power, a gentle fading rather than a violent end. In that year, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, leading a contingent of mercenary soldiers who had served Rome for years, made a crucial demand. They sought land within Italy itself, a recognition of their service, a place to call their own. When this was refused, Odoacer marched on Ravenna, the last effective capital of the Western Roman Empire. There he deposed the last Roman emperor in the West, a young boy named Romulus Augustulus. What's particularly poignant about this moment is the name itself, Romulus, echoing the mythical founder of Rome, and Augustulus, a diminutive of Augustus, the title of its first emperor. It was, in many ways, the end of a very long cycle. Odoacer did not take the imperial title for himself. Instead, he simply sent the imperial regalia, the symbols of Roman rule, back to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet statement that the game had changed, that the power had shifted irrevocably. The Western Empire, in essence, simply ceased to govern itself. Historians, of course, have debated this moment for centuries. Was it a true asterisk fall, or simply a profound asterisk transformation? Perhaps it was both, a fall for the centralized political entity we knew as the Western Empire, and a transformation for the lands and peoples once under its sway. The various Germanic peoples, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, and others who had long lived on the fringes, or even within the empire, now began to carve out their own kingdoms, shaping the nascent contours of medieval Europe. The Roman way of life, the intricate legal structures, the Latin language, the very idea of Romanitas continued to exert influence, but it was now filtered through new lenses, adapted by new rulers. And so, the Western Roman Empire, after centuries of unparalleled dominance, finally yielded to the collective weight of its many burdens. It wasn't a single, definitive blow, but rather a slow, gradual unraveling, a quiet drift into another age. The echoes of its laws, its roads, its literature would continue to resonate in the centuries that followed, but the imperial sun in the west had at last set. Sleeps and bray. Indeed, as we draw this long reflection to its close, we arrive at the very end of Western Rome's journey in the year 476. You see, the young Romulus Augustulus, a mere boy, found his brief reign brought to an abrupt halt, not by a grand, decisive battle, nor by a cunning political coup from within the established Roman order, but by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. This Odoacer, a soldier, a mercenary in many ways, simply took Ravenna, the then capital of the Western Empire, and removed the boy emperor from his ceremonial throne. He then sent the imperial regalia, the symbols of Rome's ancient power, back to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, declaring that one emperor was quite enough. What makes this specific moment, this quiet deposing, so profound is its symbolism. It wasn't the thunderous collapse of a mighty edifice, but rather the flickering out of a distant ember. The Western Empire had by this point become a shadow of its former self, its coffers drained, its legions diminished, its lands carved up by the migrating peoples who now called themselves kings within its former borders. Notion of a singular, unified Roman West had, in truth, already dwindled into little more than a legal fiction. Yet the story doesn't truly end there, in 476. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now often refer to as the Byzantine Empire, continued to flourish for another 1,000 years, preserving much of Roman law, culture, and learning. It becomes clearer then that the fall of Rome, as we so often describe it, was not a singular cataclysmic event, but rather a prolonged transformation. Imagine, if you will, a great river that over centuries begins to split into many smaller streams, each finding its own course. The river doesn't truly vanish, but its identity as one mighty flow changes irrevocably. Historians, you see, continue to deliberate over this fall, pondering whether it was truly a collapse, or perhaps more accurately, a long, gradual metamorphosis into something new. The very act of applying a definitive end date to such a complex, sprawling civilization is, in itself, an interpretation. A way for us to frame a narrative around the immense, slow-moving currents of history, and in doing so we gain perspective. We learn that empires, like all things, are not immutable. They rise, they adapt, they transform, and sometimes they simply fade into new forms. So, as our journey through the long twilight of the Roman Empire concludes, I wish to thank you for joining me on this exploration, for venturing into these quiet reflections on the ebb and flow of civilizations. If you found these lessons comforting, perhaps even thought-provoking, I would be most grateful if you would consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a gentle thumbs up. It truly helps others find these bedtime lessons. And do remember, there are other chronicles, other stories, waiting within this archive for you to discover. Until then, may your dreams be sweet and your rest profound.